Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, thank you very much for the opportunity to contribute to the Commerce Commission International Cooperation Fees Bill, and in doing so can I acknowledge the Commerce Select Committee and its Chair, Jonathan Young, who was with us in the House, and just to acknowledge the work that he is doing as Chairman of that committee through a very busy program, and to acknowledge that contribution. I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of the member that's just resumed his seat. I would, however, like to observe that there was a very important debate on the previous bill in relation to migration, and I noted that he didn't take a call, couldn't possibly comment on whether he was in the House or not, but it was only half an hour ago, and it was unusual that we didn't hear from him on that, as the government is taking draconian measures to abrogate proper process in respect of asylum seekers, and I'm disappointed for him and his community that as he was sent to Wellington to convey a message, he seems to have forgotten what the message was. But back to the Commerce Commission International Cooperation and Fees Bill. Labor is supporting the bill. It was a bill originally introduced by the Honourable Leanne Dalzell and adopted by the Honourable Simon Power, and now in the hands of the Honourable Craig Foss. It was reported back from Select Committee in November 2010. It's unfortunately been languishing on the order paper. So what does the bill do? Well, this is firstly part of the work program on a memorandum of understanding between Australia and New Zealand on business law coordination. It's part of the Single Economic Market program, which is designed to harmonise business law between New Zealand and Australia. It's important, Mr Speaker, before we dive down into the substantive provisions of the bill, that we set the context for it. The first is that of all foreign direct investment into New Zealand, about 80%, $4.05, is sourced from Australian investors and parent companies, including 95% of our banking system, a fair bit of our agricultural service companies, the parent ownership of a large part of our manufacturing sector. Mr Speaker, implicit in this debate is that New Zealand needs to find the best legal framework to get the best it can out of its relationship with Australia. Now, the Labor Party has been broadly supportive across the previous government and still of the broad outline of the SEM, the Single Economic Market process, but with some important provisos. The first is that, Mr Speaker, we note the government's changed the objective for New Zealand from doing what is in New Zealand's national interests, which one would have thought was their day job, to doing what is in the joint interests of Australia and New Zealand. The trouble with that is, when you try to work out or calculate what's in the joint interests of the two countries, New Zealand's interests tend to get a bit swamped by the big fella over the ditch. And therefore the potential is heightened for New Zealand's interests to be subsumed. So, Mr Speaker, it is with that cautionary note that we acknowledge the role of SEM in this bill, and to encourage the government always to focus on New Zealand's national interest and on the quality, not the quantity, of the investment flows. I see Dr Huo is here, and I'd like to just acknowledge that our investment law is and should be non-country specific and not differentiate between source country. We ought to have a set of rules that are applied without prejudice that serve our national interests. Mr Speaker, let me turn to some of the substantive provisions. This bill is designed to allow regulators on both sides of the Tasman and more broadly to ensure that they can swap information, swap best practice, and they need to do that because multinational business, often the poachers in the language of the regulators, don't respect borders because they're multinational, so the gamekeepers need to be able to catch up with them across the borders too. That means they need a memorandum of understanding for cooperation and protecting information which has legal consequences when they are involved in joint operations. Mr Speaker, there are some important examples that have been given by the government which we support around cross-border cooperation in the telecommunications aspect, and in particular on mobile termination rates between the New Zealand Commerce Commission and the Australian competition authorities. Mr. Speaker, in doing so, can I say we think that that's a very good thing. The powers that our Commerce Commission is using are powers that were conferred by the previous government following the stocktake review in 2006. They have led to a more robust and rigorous regulatory framework for the sector that has, interestingly enough, led to a rough doubling of investment, a drop in the price of broadband and a massive lift in the uptake. And likewise, a drop in the prices of mobile phones and a lift in uptake, and this is another part of that. Can I acknowledge in doing so the work of the ACCC, the Australian regulators, which is of a high quality, and also acknowledge the work of Dr. Ross Patterson, the Telecommunications Commissioner in New Zealand. He's held that job for some time. He was the Commissioner in the mid-2000s when I was the Minister, and he has always done an extremely professional job. I wish to acknowledge that he has been a senior practitioner on both sides of the Tasman, knows the market both sides and the practices of the ACCC, so no doubt under his leadership the Commerce Commission will make extremely good use of the provisions in this bill. All has not always been good in the area of telecommunications regulation. It was a sad day when the current government decided to sell the law down with a 10-year regulatory holiday in order to facilitate the structural separation of telecom. Now, no problem with structural separation, that's a good thing, but selling the law with a 10-year holiday is not, and I am pleased to say that pressure brought to bear by the industry and the Labour opposition forced them to think better of that idea. We have a slightly watered-down law, but not as bad as it could have been. But it does show that that minister, Mr. Joyce, has a habit of cutting deals, like his boss, Mr. Key, cutting deals which threaten our legal framework. The same minister, Mr. Joyce, was responsible for a deferral of the spectrum licence fees, totalling about $45 million, to the company that he used to personally own. And I wonder what provisions were in place under the Cabinet manual to avoid any possible perception of conflict of interest. I assume that he's used some. I assume that he's used some, but it's not a good look, nonetheless. Not a good look. And the same minister's been involved in yet another deal called with Sky City to build a casino convention centre with another 500-odd pokie machines and a very important but little-known provision which is called ticket-to-ticket betting. Now, I want to put that name up in light. Ticket-to-ticket betting. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Still go.
Yeah, 2 minutes to go, but I would just remind the member that we're on the second reading of the Commerce Commission.
Absolutely.
And the member is departing from that.
So only very, very briefly.
No, well, not at all. Not anymore.
Not anymore, because I was about to mention that in line with the terms of these bills, the South Australian government and its regulator, when confronted with exactly the same proposal from the same company, said, and I quote, "They must be dreaming. Must be dreaming." No new pokies for them in Adelaide, and no ticket-to-ticket betting, which is illegal under the Australian authorities, but which Sky City, I understand, is seeking to make legal in New Zealand, and apparently that's worth more to them than the additional pokie machines. So I just want to have that on the record as we look at Trans-Tasman regulation. The ACCC, sir, however, has historically been more robust than our Commerce Commission. It didn't fall into the hole that was known as euthanasia or neoliberalism here in New Zealand. They never went as light-handed. They never had a wasted decade. They managed to have reform that was more balanced than occurred under the previous national government in the previous to this one. And therefore there's been less need to wind back that ill-fated experiment than it has been required in New Zealand. So we are pleased, sir, that New Zealand, having fought its way back to the international mainstream, we are now able to cooperate with our Australian cousins where it's in our interest to do so. It is a tenuous grip under the current government, as my colleague Mr. Little has said, and you always got to wonder with the current government whether it's really New Zealand's interest as a whole that they're seeking to serve, or whether it's some corporate in the big end of town that might have had dinner with the Prime Minister in the last month or so, to say nothing of helicopter rides or...
Order. The member's time has expired.
Oh, what a shame. I was just getting going.
Mark Mitchell.